Welcome to the second episode of the history of hockey in Toronto leading up to the birth of the Toronto Maple Leafs. When the last episode ended, Toronto's first professional hockey team had just disbanded. Toronto still had plenty of amateur teams, but amateurs only played for the Allen Cup. If Toronto was going to win its first Stanley Cup, it would need a new team of pros, or two teams of pros as things turned out. But first, Toronto teams needed a new place to play. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller. And this is Muddy York.
At the start of the 1910s, Mutual Street Rink was the largest hockey venue in town, but it couldn't hold more than 2,800 paying customers. Westmount Arena in Montreal could hold 4,500, and Denman Arena in Vancouver had room for more than 10,000. If professional hockey was going to be viable in Toronto, teams needed to be able to sell more game tickets. Thaws in the middle of winter also made it clear that any new rink would need to have artificial ice. Plus, in the great local tradition, Toronto wanted to have artificial ice just to show that we were as advanced as other cities. In 1911, the Toronto Arena Company bought the Mutual Street Rink. The consortium behind the new company was led by Henry Pellet, the man who built Casa Loma and the subject of a previous podcast. But the big money came from Montreal, and the new owners were connected to the National Hockey Association, the NHL's predecessor. They planned to build the long-promised arena, and they wanted an NHA team to fill the stands. A team was promptly awarded to the Toronto Lacrosse Club for $2,000. Lacrosse had already gone pro, so it seemed like a good fit. The problem was that their crosstown rivals, the Tecumseh Lacrosse Club, wanted their own hockey franchise, and the arena company's managing director just happened to be their patron. As such, Toronto was awarded two new NHA teams. They were supposed to begin playing in the 1912 NHA season. However, that schedule depended on the new arena being ready on time, and like most Toronto construction projects, it wasn't. So, Toronto's return to pro hockey was delayed for a year.
The new arena finally opened in 1912. It was officially called Arena Gardens, but everyone called it the Mutual Street Arena. So, just to clarify, the old building was the Mutual Street Rink. The new building was the Mutual Street Arena. Until 1923, it was the only artificial ice rink east of Winnipeg. The new building could seat more than 7,000 people and cost about $500,000. Just for comparison, Scotiabank Arena costs $265 million and can hold about 19,000 people per game. The opening event for the new arena was an opera performance of all things. For all that, the new arena wasn't very fancy, even by contemporary standards. Multiple writers compared it to a barn. All the seats were wooden benches, kind of like church pews, and there was chicken wire to separate standing room from the seats. Pro hockey games began in December 1912 with two teams, the Toronto Blue Shirts and the Toronto Tecumsehs. The Tecumsehs began a distinguished Toronto hockey tradition by signing a group of aging veterans and journeyman players for the new team. In the first season, they had a losing record, lost $2,500, and were promptly sold to new owners. The newly renamed Toronto Ontarios were even worse in their second season and finished with a dismal 4-16 record. On the other hand, the Blue Shirts put together a team of promising young players, including 4 future Hall of Famers. Like the Tecumsehs, they had a losing record for their first season, but the 1914 Blue Shirts would become the first Toronto team to carry the Stanley Cup. They didn't make things easy for themselves. In true Toronto fashion, they blew a 2-game lead at the end of the season to force a playoff series with the Habs. Incidentally, those Habs were led by Newsy Lalonde, who began his pro career with the old Toronto Professionals, but had been driven out of town when the team fell apart. Now, he was the star of Montreal out for revenge. But amazingly, Toronto recovered from a 2-0 deficit and won the playoff 6-2.
There was only one more step. the Blue Shirts had to defeat the Victoria Aristocrats of the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, or PCHA. This was going to be challenging because half of the games would be played under PCHA rules. The PCHA still played 7-man hockey, while the NHL had switched to the 6-man game we know today. That's 5 skaters and the goalie. The PCHA also allowed forward passes in the neutral zone, unlike the NHA. However, the Blue Shirts swept the series 3-0, including an overtime win in Game 2, which was played under PCHA rules. Toronto had won its first ever Stanley Cup. But despite their victory, the Blue Shirts were unable to fill Mutual Street Arena. On the morning of the first game against Victoria, the Globe advertised 1,700 rush seats available. Now, can you imagine tickets for sale on the morning before a Stanley Cup Finals game at Scotiabank Place? Attendance for the finals against Victoria averaged 4,753. By contrast, a pair of local games between amateur teams averaged more than 7,000 fans. This just shows that in Toronto, amateur hockey teams like St. Michael's, Parkdale, and the Toronto Canoe Club were at least as popular as the pros, and would continue to be until the Depression. Most fans agreed that the quality of play at these amateur games wasn't noticeably lower than for pro games.
Now we come to one of the most colorful characters in the history of Toronto hockey, Eddie Livingstone, also known as Livy. During the summer of 1914, the Toronto Ontarians were for sale again, and Eddie Livingstone seemed like he would be a good owner. His amateur club, the Toronto Rugby and Athletics Association, had won the Ontario Hockey Association championships for the last 2 years. Plus, he knew how to draw a crowd, having attracted more than 7,000 fans to watch his team in the 1914 title. The problem was that Livy was one of those guys who had talent for antagonizing people. He was pushy and aggressive, constantly filing lawsuits or making accusations in the press. Legendary hockey journalist Elmer Ferguson described him as, quote, a game little tyke battling against a horde of grim-faced bulldogs. He's scrapping and snapping, and if he isn't doing any great harm, he's keeping the opposition casting anxious glances at the newspaper headlines to see what this surprising young man will do next. For their part, the other team owners were every bit as arrogant as their modern counterparts. It would prove to be a combustible mix. His first season in the NHA went well enough, and his team improved its record to 7-13. Halfway through the season, Livingstone would rename the team as the Toronto Shamrocks. For those of you keeping track at home, that's 3 team names in 3 years. First the Tecumsehs, then the Ontarios, and finally the Shamrocks. After the 1915 season, the Blue Shirts were put up for sale, and Livingstone offered to buy the team. The other team owners didn't object to him buying the Blue Shirts so long as he sold the Shamrocks. He promised he would, and he said he had a buyer lined up. This man was lying.
Just after he purchased the Blue Shirts, the Patrick brothers of the PCHA raided the team and signed almost the entire roster. The Patricks were creating a new team in Seattle and decided to use the Blue Shirts players to build it. But the curious thing is that the Patricks only targeted the Blue Shirts and made no attempt to sign players from other teams. Equally curious was that Livingston barely reacted. Livy was famously combative, willing to fight with anyone about anything, and yet he didn't seem angry with the Patricks or with the players who had just abandoned his new team. The reason for this calm response became clear when Livingston announced that he was transferring the Shamrocks players to the Blue Shirts and shutting down the other team. Quote, I think the best plan is to let Toronto have one good team this year and it will be royally supported. 2 teams of ordinary caliber will hurt the program in Toronto, not help it. The other team owners were furious. The NHA wanted to keep 2 teams in Toronto because traveling from Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec City was expensive in those days. 2 teams meant 2 games, and visiting teams received 30% of the receipts from ticket sales. Unfortunately for them, Livy seems to have decided that he didn't want to share Toronto with another team, not unlike MLSE. The NHA didn't have time to find new owners for the Shamrocks and had to accept that there would only be one team in Toronto that season. As an epilogue to this story, the Seattle Metropolitans of the PCHA would win the Stanley Cup in 1917. Over half of the players on that cup-winning team were former Blue Shirts, who had won the Cup in Toronto 3 years earlier. If not for Livingstone's deal with the Patricks, 1917 might have been Toronto's second Cup title.
For the 1917 season, the NHA came up with a creative way to add a second team from Toronto. World War I was underway and lots of hockey players had enlisted in the Canadian Army, so the league added an Army team. For the first half of the season, the Toronto 228th Battalion had an NHA team. They wore khaki uniforms and played a regular schedule at the Mutual Street Arena. They had the highest attendance in the league and were just one game out of first when the whole battalion was ordered to deploy overseas. Army leaders didn't like the idea that some recruits fought and died in the trenches while others played professional hockey. Once the team had been suspended, some of the players began telling the press that they had been paid special salaries or promised an officer's commission if they had agreed to play hockey for the 228th. So, withdrawing the team was probably a good idea. Since the NHA wanted a balanced four-team schedule, and because the other owners were fed up with Livy, they decided to drop both Toronto clubs for the second half of the schedule. The NHA ordered Livingstone to sell the team before the beginning of next season, but he sued and won a court order blocking the sale. He also sued to force the league to include Blue Shirts in the next season's schedule. The other owners decided that if they couldn't force Livy to leave the NHA, then they would. On November 10th, the NHA voted to suspend operations for the 1918 season. 12 days later, the National Hockey League was officially created. One of the other team owners told a reporter, quote, "We didn't throw Eddie Livingstone out. Perish the thought. That would have been illegal and unfair. Also, it wouldn't have been sporting. We just resigned and wished him a fine future with the National Association franchise."
However, the new NHL had an immediate problem. The Quebec Bulldogs of the NHA had to suspend operations because of the war. If the NHA wanted a balanced four-team schedule, it would need to have a team in Toronto. The NHL's solution was to award a temporary franchise to the Toronto Arena Company, who owned Mutual Street Arena. They, in turn, signed a deal with Eddie Livingston to lease the Blue Shirts players' contracts in exchange for 60% of the team's profits. To fans in the stands, it would have been hard to tell the difference between this new team and the Blue Shirts. They had the same players, wore the same uniforms, and most fans still called them the Blue Shirts.
So it all seemed to work out for Livy, eh?
Well, not for long. The Arena Company was given 1 year to convince Eddie Livingston to sell the Blue Shirts, or they would lose the franchise. But then something unexpected happened. Toronto won the Stanley Cup. This became easier once Westmount Arena burned down and the Montreal Wanderers shut down, leaving the NHL with only 3 teams. Toronto won the second half of the NHL season and then won the NHL championship by defeating the Habs, who won the first half of the season. Finally, they defeated the Vancouver Millionaires 3-2 in the Stanley Cup Finals. Toronto won the deciding game 2-1, with Corb Deneny scoring the cup-winning goal. But for reasons unknown, the team was never engraved on the Stanley Cup.
Livy figured that a team that had just won the Stanley Cup was worth extra money, but the Arena Company refused to meet his price. They also shortchanged him on a share of the team profits, so he decided to sue for $20,000. Since they had failed to convince Livingstone to sell the Blue Shirts, the Arena Company returned last season's temporary franchise to the NHL. They promptly applied for a permanent NHL franchise in Toronto, which was duly granted. The new team was called the Toronto Arenas and proceeded to sign most of the players from last year's Toronto team. Now, if you read the NHL record books, they say that the Toronto Arenas won the 1918 Stanley Cup, but that's false. And the NHL insisted in court that the Toronto Arenas were completely different from that team. They just happened to have the same player, staff, and arena. Because it was a different team, the arena company said they didn't have to share any of the profits with Livy. Whether or not they were a new team, the arenas were so thoroughly mismanaged that they couldn't even finish the season. Almost every player either left the team or had their contracts sold to other clubs. Finally, in December 1919, the franchise was sold to new owners who renamed it the Toronto St. Patrick's.
Here's a quick review for those of you trying to keep track at home. For the 1917 season, Toronto had two teams that only played half of the season. One team was suspended, the other left to fight in the trenches. For 1918, Toronto had a new franchise with the same players and uniforms as the Toronto Blue Shirts, but new owners. They won the Stanley Cup. In 1919, Toronto had another new franchise with a new name and a new uniform, but the same players. They couldn't even finish the season. Finally, in 1920, Toronto had the same franchise, but with new owners, new players, and a new name. It may not surprise you to hear that pro hockey wasn't exactly dominating the Toronto sports scene. On the other hand, amateur hockey was thriving. In March 1919, Mutual Street Arena hosted the finals of the Allen Cup and the first edition of the Memorial Cup. Both competitions drew substantially more fans than the NHL. The Memorial Cup game was especially satisfying for Toronto fans as the University of Toronto schools, what we all know as UTS, defeated the Regina Patricias 29-8. In 1922, the St. Patrick's would make their only appearance in the Stanley Cup Finals. After placing second during the regular season, they upset the two-time champion Ottawa Senators in the NHL Finals. Just like 1918, they would face Vancouver for the Stanley Cup, and just like 1918, they would win 3-2. Babe Dye was the star of the series, scoring 9 of Toronto's 16 goals, including the overtime winner in Game 2. He almost missed the entire series because he was also a pro baseball player and he was due to report for spring training. At the last minute, the Buffalo Bisons gave him permission to report late, and Toronto won its third Stanley Cup. The following season would see the first ever radio broadcast of a live hockey game. On February 8, 1923, CFCA broadcast part of the third period of an amateur game between North Toronto and Midland. 6 days later, it broadcast a match between Toronto and the Ottawa Senators, making it the first NHL game to be aired on radio.
You guys can't see it, but I'm actually wearing a North Toronto hockey shirt right now. Back to the story. Unfortunately, the St. Patrick's would only make the playoffs one more time, and they continued to have trouble drawing fans. By 1927, the team was in financial trouble, partly because Eddie Livingstone had finally won his lawsuit and was awarded $15,000 in damages. A group from Philadelphia offered to pay $200,000 for the team, but instead it was sold to a local group led by Conn Smythe. Smythe's bid was $40,000 lower, but the team shareholder, J.P. Bickle, insisted that civic pride was more important than money. My kind of guy.
After taking control on Valentine's Day 1927, Smythe immediately renamed the team the Toronto Maple Leafs, after the Canadian national symbol. He attributed his choice to his experiences as an officer and POW during World War I. He said the Maple Leaf was a badge of courage and a reminder of home. Smythe decided to give the name to his hockey team in honor of the many Canadian soldiers who'd worn it. This gave birth to the team that we all know today, for better and for worse. If you'd like to know about what happened next, you can read one of the approximately 700 books that are published about the Leafs every year, but this is where our story ends for today. Thank you for listening to Muddy York. If you want to get in touch with us, our email address is muddy_york@outlook.com. We actually just received our first official email from a reader in Vancouver. Well, not a reader, a listener in Vancouver who liked to listen to it as a reminder of home, which was very heartwarming. If you want to find us on live, you can find us on Twitter or X or whatever Elon decides to call it tomorrow. It's Toronto_history. We have an account on Blue Sky at Muddy York. And we have a Facebook address, which is Muddy York History, all one word. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you all in February.